Synchronicity, an a-causal connecting principle, from Volume 8 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung. Chapter 1, Exposition. The discoveries of modern physics have, as we know, brought about a significant change in our scientific picture of the world, in that they have shattered the absolute validity of natural law and made it relative. Natural laws are statistical truths, which means that they are completely valid only when we are dealing with macrophysical quantities. In the realm of very small quantities, prediction becomes uncertain, if not impossible, because very small quantities no longer behave in accordance with the known natural laws. The philosophical principle that underlies our conception of natural law is causality. But if the connection between cause and effect turns out to be only statistically valid and only relatively true, then the causal principle is only of relative use for explaining natural processes and therefore presupposes the existence of one or more other factors which would be necessary for an explanation. This is as much as to say that the connection of events may in certain circumstances be other than causal and requires another principle of explanation. We shall naturally look round in vain in the macrophysical world for a-causal events, for the simple reason that we cannot imagine events that are connected non-causally and are capable of a non-causal explanation. But that does not mean that such events do not exist. Their existence, or at least their possibility, follows logically from the premise of statistical truth. The experimental method of inquiry aims at establishing regular events which can be repeated. Consequently, unique or rare events are ruled out of account. Moreover, the experiment imposes limiting conditions on nature, for its aim is to force her to give answers to questions devised by man. Every answer of nature is therefore more or less influenced by the kind of questions asked, and the result is always a hybrid product. The so-called scientific view of the world, based on this, can hardly be anything more than a psychologically biased partial view which misses out all those by no means unimportant aspects that cannot be grasped statistically. But to grasp these unique or rare events at all, we seem to be dependent on equally unique and individual descriptions. This would result in a chaotic collection of curiosities, rather like those old natural history cabinets where one finds, cheek by jowl with fossils and anatomical monsters in bottles, the horn of a unicorn, a mandragora mannequin, and a dried mermaid. The descriptive sciences, and above all biology in the widest sense, are familiar with these unique specimens, and in their case, and only one example of an organism, no matter how unbelievable it may be, is needed to establish its existence. At any rate, numerous observers will be able to convince themselves, on the evidence of their own eyes, that such a creature does in fact exist. But where we are dealing with ephemeral events which leave no demonstrable traces behind them, except fragmentary memories in people's minds, then a single witness no longer suffices, nor would several witnesses be enough to make a unique event appear absolutely credible. One has only to think of the notorious unreliability of eyewitness accounts. In these circumstances, we are faced with the necessity of finding out whether the apparently unique event is really unique in our recorded experience, or whether the same or similar events are not to be found elsewhere. Here the consensus omnium plays a very important role psychologically, though empirically it is somewhat doubtful, for only in exceptional cases does the consensus omnium prove to be of value in establishing facts. The empiricist will not leave it out of account, but will do better not to rely on it. Absolutely unique and ephemeral events whose existence we have no means of either denying or proving can never be the object of empirical science. Rare events might very well be, provided that there was a sufficient number of reliable individual observations. The so-called possibility of such events is of no importance whatever, for the criterion of what is possible in any age is derived from that age's rationalistic assumptions. there are no absolute natural laws to whose authority one can appeal in support of one's prejudices. The most that can be fairly demanded is that the number of individual observations shall be as high as possible. If this number, statistically considered, falls within the limits of chance expectation, then it has been statistically proved that it was a question of chance. But no explanation has thereby been furnished. There has merely been an exception to the rule. When, for instance, the number of symptoms indicating a complex falls below the probable number of disturbances to be expected during the association experiment, this is no justification for assuming that no complex exists. But that did not prevent the reaction disturbances from being regarded earlier as pure chance. Although, in biology especially, we move in a sphere where causal explanations often seem very unsatisfactory, indeed, well nigh impossible, we shall not concern ourselves here with the problems of biology, but rather with the question of whether there may not be some general field where acausal events not only are possible, but are found to be actual facts. Now, there is in our experience an immeasurably wide field whose extent forms, as it were, the counterbalance to the domain of causality. This is the world of chance, where a chance event seems causally unconnected with the coinciding fact. So we shall have to examine the nature and the whole idea of chance a little more closely. Chance, we say, must obviously be susceptible of some causal explanation, and is only called chance or coincidence because its causality has not yet been discovered. Since we have an inveterate conviction of the absolute validity of causal law, we regard this explanation of chance as being quite adequate. But if the causal principle is only relatively valid, then it follows that even though in the vast majority of cases an apparently chance series can be causally explained, there must still remain a number of cases which do not show any causal connection. We are therefore faced with the task of sifting chance events and separating the acausal ones from those that can be causally explained. It stands to reason that the number of causally explicable events will far exceed those suspected of acausality, for which reason a superficial or prejudiced observer may easily overlook the relatively rare acausal phenomena. As soon as we come to deal with the problem of chance, the need for a statistical evaluation of the events in question forces itself upon us. It is not possible to sift the empirical material without a criterion of distinction. How are we to recognize acausal combinations of events, since it is obviously impossible to examine all chance happenings for their causality? The answer to this is that acausal events may be expected most readily where, on closer reflection, a causal connection appears to be inconceivable. As an example, I would cite the duplication of cases, which is a phenomenon well known to every doctor. Occasionally there is a trebling or even more, so that Kammerer can speak of a law of series, of which he gives a number of excellent examples. In the majority of such cases, there is not even the remotest probability of a causal connection between the coinciding events. When, for instance, I am faced with the fact that my tram ticket bears the same number as the theater ticket, which I buy immediately afterwards, and I receive that same evening a telephone call during which the same number is mentioned again as a telephone number, then a causal connection between these events seems to me improbable in the extreme, although it is obvious that each must have its own causality. I know, on the other hand, that chance happenings have a tendency to fall into aperiodic groupings, necessarily so, because otherwise there would be only a periodic or regular arrangement of events, which would by definition exclude chance. Kammerer holds that though runs or successions of chance events are not subject to the operation of a common cause, that is, are acausal, they are nevertheless an expression of inertia, the property of persistence. The simultaneity of a run of the same thing side by side he explains as imitation. Here he contradicts himself, for the run of chance has not been removed outside the realm of the explicable, but, as we would expect, is included within it, and is consequently reducible, if not to a common cause, then at least to several causes. His concepts of seriality, imitation, attraction, and inertia belong to a causally conceived view of the world, and tell us no more than that the run of chance corresponds to statistical and mathematical probability. Kammerer's factual material contains nothing but runs of chance whose only law is probability. In other words, there is no apparent reason why he should look behind them for anything else. But for some obscure reason he does look behind them for something more than mere probability warrants, for a law of seriality which he would like to introduce as a principle coexistent with causality and finality. This tendency, as I have said, is in no way justified by his material. I can only explain this obvious contradiction by supposing that he had a dim but fascinated intuition of an acausal arrangement and combination of events, probably because, like all thoughtful and sensitive natures, he could not escape the peculiar impression which runs of chance usually make on us, and therefore, in accordance with his scientific disposition, took the bold step of postulating an acausal seriality on the basis of empirical material that lay within the limits of probability. Unfortunately, he did not attempt a quantitative evaluation of seriality. Such an undertaking would undoubtedly have thrown up questions that are difficult to answer. The investigation of individual cases serves well enough for the purpose of general orientation, but only quantitative evaluation or the statistical method promises results in dealing with chance. Chance groupings or series seem, at least to our present way of thinking, to be meaningless, and to fall as a general rule within the limits of probability. There are, however, incidents whose chancefulness seems open to doubt. To mention but one example out of many, I noted the following on April 1st, 1949. Today is Friday. We have fish for lunch. Somebody happens to mention the custom of making an April fish of someone. That same morning I made a note of an inscription which read, Est homo totus medius piscis ab imo. In the afternoon, a former patient of mine, whom I had not seen for months, showed me some extremely impressive pictures of fish which she had painted in the meantime. In the evening I was shown a piece of embroidery with fish-like sea monsters on it. In the morning of April 2, another patient, whom I had not seen for many years, told me a dream in which she stood on the shore of a lake and saw a large fish that swam straight towards her and landed at her feet. I was at this time engaged on a study of the fish symbol in history. Only one of the persons mentioned here knew anything about it. The suspicion that this must be a case of meaningful coincidence, that is, an acausal connection, is very natural. I must own that this run of events made a considerable impression on me. It seemed to me to have a certain numinous quality. In such circumstances we are inclined to say that cannot be mere chance without knowing what exactly we are saying. Kammerer would no doubt have reminded me of his seriality. The strength of an impression, however, proves nothing against the fortuitous coincidence of all these fishes. It is, admittedly, exceedingly odd that the fish theme recurs no less than 6 times within 24 hours. But one must remember that fish on Friday is the usual thing, and on April 1 one might very easily think of the April fish. I had at that time been working on the fish symbol for several months. Fishes frequently occur as symbols of unconscious contents. So there is no possible justification for seeing in this anything but a chance grouping. Runs or series which are composed of quite ordinary occurrences must for the present be regarded as fortuitous. However wide their range may be, they must be ruled out as acausal connections.
It is, therefore, generally assumed that all coincidences are lucky hits and do not require an a-causal interpretation. This assumption can, and indeed must, be regarded as true so long as proof is lacking that their incidence exceeds the limits of probability. Should this proof be forthcoming, however, it would prove at the same time that there are genuinely non-causal combinations of events for whose explanation we should have to postulate a factor incommensurable with causality. We should then have to assume that events in general are related to one another on the one hand as causal chains, and on the other hand by a kind of meaningful cross-connection. Here I should like to draw attention to a treatise of Schopenhauer's, On the Apparent Design in the Fate of the Individual, which originally stood godfather to the views I am now developing. It deals with the simultaneity of the causally unconnected, which we call chance. Schopenhauer illustrates this simultaneity by a geographical analogy, where the parallels represent the cross-connection between the meridians, which are thought of as causal chains. All the events in a man's life would accordingly stand in two fundamentally different kinds of connection. Firstly, in the objective, causal connection of the natural process. Secondly, in a subjective connection which exists only in relation to the individual who experiences it, and which is thus as subjective as his own dreams. That both kinds of connection exist simultaneously, and the self-same event, although a link in two totally different chains, nevertheless falls into place in both, so that the fate of one individual invariably fits the fate of the other, and each is the hero of his own drama, while simultaneously figuring in a drama foreign to him. This is something that surpasses our powers of comprehension, and can only be conceived as possible by virtue of the most wonderful pre-established harmony.
In his view, the subject of the great dream of life is but one, the transcendental will, the prima causa, from which all causal chains radiate like meridian lines from the poles and, because of the circular parallels, stand to one another in a meaningful relationship of simultaneity. Schopenhauer believed in the absolute determinism of the natural process, and furthermore, in a first cause. There is nothing to warrant either assumption. The first cause is a philosophical mythologem which is only credible when it appears in the form of the old paradox, Greek characters, as unity and multiplicity at once. The idea that the simultaneous points in the causal chains, or meridians, represent meaningful coincidences would only hold water if the first cause were really a unity. But if it were a multiplicity, which is just as likely, then Schopenhauer's whole explanation collapses, quite apart from the fact, which we have only recently realized, that natural law possesses a merely statistical validity and thus keeps the door open to indeterminism. Neither philosophical reflection nor experience can provide any evidence for the regular occurrence of these two kinds of connection, in which the same thing is both subject and object. Schopenhauer thought and wrote at a time when causality held sovereign sway as a category, a priori, and had therefore to be dragged in to explain meaningful coincidences. But, as we have seen, it can do this with some degree of probability only if we have recourse to the other, equally arbitrary assumption of the unity of the first cause. It then follows as a necessity that every point on a given meridian stands in a relationship of meaningful coincidence to every other point on the same degree of latitude. This conclusion, however, goes far beyond the bounds of what is empirically possible, for it credits meaningful coincidences with occurring so regularly and systematically that their verification would be either unnecessary or the simplest thing in the world. Schopenhauer's examples carry as much or as little conviction as all the others. Nevertheless, it is to his credit that he saw the problem and understood that there were no facile ad hoc explanations. Since this problem is concerned with the foundations of our epistemology, he derived it in accordance with the general trend of his philosophy from a transcendental premise, from the will which creates life and being on all levels, and which modulates each of these levels in such a way that they are not only in harmony with their synchronous parallels, but also prepare and arrange future events in the form of fate or providence. In contrast to Schopenhauer's accustomed pessimism, this utterance has an almost friendly and optimistic tone which we can hardly sympathize with today. One of the most problematical and momentous centuries the world has ever known separates us from that still medievalistic age when the philosophizing mind believed it could make assertions beyond what could be empirically proved. It was an age of large views, which did not cry halt and think that the limits of nature had been reached just where the scientific road builders had come to a temporary stop. Thus Schopenhauer, with true philosophical vision, opened up a field for reflection whose peculiar phenomenology he was not equipped to understand, though he outlined it more or less correctly. He recognized that with their omnia and presagia astrology and the various intuitive methods of interpreting fate have a common denominator which he sought to discover by means of transcendental speculation. He recognized, equally rightly, that it was a problem of principle of the first order, unlike all those before and after him who operated with futile conceptions of some kind of energy transmission or conveniently dismissed the whole thing as nonsense in order to avoid a too difficult task. Schopenhauer's attempt is the more remarkable in that it was made at a time when the tremendous advance of the natural sciences had convinced everybody that causality alone could be considered the first principle of explanation. Instead of ignoring all those experiences which refused to bow down to the sovereign rule of causality, he tried, as we have seen, to fit them into his deterministic view of the world. In so doing, he forced concepts like prefiguration, correspondence, and pre-established harmony, which as a universal order coexisting with the causal one have always underlain man's explanations of nature, into the causal scheme, probably because he felt, and rightly, that the scientific view of the world based on natural law, though he did not doubt its validity, nevertheless lacked something which played a considerable role in the classical and medieval view, as it also does in the intuitive feelings of modern man. The mass of facts collected by Gurney, Myers, and Podmore inspired three other investigators, Derriex, Richet, and Flammarion, to tackle the problem in terms of a probability calculus. Derriex found a probability of 1 to 4,114,545 for telepathic precognitions of death, which means that the explanation of such a warning as due to chance is more than 4 million times more improbable than explaining it as telepathic or acausal, meaningful coincidence. The astronomer Flammarion reckoned a probability of no less than 1 to 804,622,222 for a particularly well-observed instance of phantasms of the living. He was also the first to link up other suspicious happenings with the general interest in phenomena connected with death. Thus he relates that, while writing his book on the atmosphere, he was just at the chapter on wind force when a sudden gust of wind swept all of his papers off the table and blew them out of the window. He also cites, as an example of triple coincidence, the edifying story of Monsieur de Fordigueux and the plum pudding. The fact that he mentions these coincidences at all in connection with the problem of telepathy shows that Flammarion had a distinct intuition, albeit an unconscious one, of a far more comprehensive principle. The writer Wilhelm von Schultz has collected a number of stories showing the strange ways in which lost or stolen objects come back to their owners. Among other things, he tells the story of a mother who took a photograph of her small son in the Black Forest. She left the film to be developed in Strasbourg, but, owing to the outbreak of war, she was unable to fetch it and gave it up for lost. In 1916, she bought a film in Frankfurt in order to take a photograph of her daughter, who had been born in the meantime. When the film was developed, it was found to be doubly exposed. The picture underneath was the photograph she had taken of her son in 1914. The old film had not been developed and had somehow got into circulation again among the new films.
the author comes to the understandable conclusion that everything points to the mutual attraction of related objects, or an elective affinity. He suspects that these happenings are arranged as if they were the dream of a greater and more comprehensive consciousness, which is unknowable. The problem of chance has been approached from the psychological angle by Herbert Silberer. He shows that apparently meaningful coincidences are partly unconscious arrangements, and partly unconscious, arbitrary interpretations. He takes no account either of parapsychic phenomena or of synchronicity, and theoretically he does not go much beyond the causalism of Schopenhauer. Apart from its valuable psychological criticism of our methods of evaluating chance, Silberer's study contains no reference to the occurrence of meaningful coincidences as here understood. Decisive evidence for the existence of a-causal combinations of events has been furnished, with adequate scientific safeguards, only very recently, mainly through the experiments of J.B. Rhine and his fellow workers, who have not, however, recognized the far-reaching conclusions that must be drawn from their findings. Up to the present, no critical argument that cannot be refuted has been brought against these experiments. The experiments consists, in principle, in an experimenter turning up, one after another, a series of numbered cards bearing simple geometrical patterns. At the same time, the subject, separated by a screen from the experimenter, is given the task of guessing the signs as they are turned up. A pack of 25 cards is used, each 5 of which carry the same sign. 5 cards are marked with a star, 5 with a square, 5 with a circle, 5 with wavy lines, and 5 with a cross. The experimenter naturally does not know the order in which the pack is arranged, nor has the subject any opportunity of seeing the cards. Many of the experiments were negative, since the result did not exceed the probability of 5 chance hits. In the case of certain subjects, however, some results were distinctly above probability. The first series of experiments consisted in each subject trying to guess the cards 800 times. The average result showed 6.5 hits for 25 cards, which is 1.5 more than the chance probability of 5 hits. The probability of there being a chance deviation of 1.5 from the number 5 works out at 1 to 250,000. This proportion shows that the probability of a chance deviation is not exactly high, since it is to be expected only once in 250,000 cases. The results vary according to the specific gift of the individual subject. One young man, who in numerous experiments scored an average of 10 hits for every 25 cards, double the probable number, once guessed all 25 cards correctly, which gives a probability of 1 to very large number. The possibility of the pack being shuffled in some arbitrary way is guarded against by an apparatus which shuffles the cards automatically, independently of the experimenter. And a quick narrator's note, I will put that number in the description. After the first series of experiments, the spatial distance between the experimenter and the subject was increased, in one case to 250 miles. The average result of numerous experiments amounted here to 10.1 hits for 25 cards. In another series of experiments, when experimenter and subject were in the same room, the score was 11.4 for 25. When the subject was in the next room, 9.7 for 25. When 2 rooms away, 12.0 for 25. Rhine mentions the experiments of F.L. Usher and E.L. Burt, which were conducted with positive results over a distance of 960 miles. With the aid of synchronized watches, experiments were also conducted between Durham, North Carolina, and Zagreb, Yugoslavia, about 4,000 miles, with equally positive results. The fact that distance has no effect in principle shows that the thing in question cannot be a phenomenon of force or energy, for otherwise the distance to be overcome and the diffusion in space would cause a diminution of the effect, and it is more than probable that the score would fall proportionately to the square of the distance. Since this is obviously not the case, we have no alternative but to assume that distance is psychically variable, and may in certain circumstances be reduced to vanishing point by a psychic condition. Even more remarkable is the fact that time is not in principle a prohibiting factor either. That is to say, the scanning of a series of cards to be turned up in the future produces a score that exceeds chance probability. The results of Rhine's time experiment show a probability of 1 to 400,000, which means a considerable probability of there being some factor independent of time. They point, in other words, to a psychic relativity of time, since the experiment was concerned with the perceptions of events which had not yet occurred. In these circumstances, the time factor seems to have been eliminated by a psychic function or psychic condition, which is also capable of abolishing the spatial factor. If, in the spatial experiments, we were obliged to admit that energy does not decrease with distance, then the time experiments make it completely impossible for us to even think of there being any energy relationship between the perception and the future event. We must give up at the outset all explanations in terms of energy, which amounts to saying that events of this kind cannot be considered from the point of view of causality, for causality presupposes the existence of space and time insofar as all observations are ultimately based upon bodies in motion. Among Rhine's experiments, we must also mention the experiments with dice. The subject has the task of throwing the dice, which is done by an apparatus, and at the same time he has to wish that one number, say 3, will turn up as many times as possible. The results of this so-called PK, psychokinetic experiment, were positive, the more so the more dice were used at one time. If space and time prove to be psychically relative, then the moving body must possess, or be subject to, a corresponding relativity. One consistent experience in all these experiments is the fact that the number of hits scored tends to sink after the first attempt, and the results then become negative. But if, for some inner or outer reason, there is a freshening of interest on the subject's part, the score rises again. Lack of interest and boredom are negative factors. Enthusiasm, positive expectation, hope, and belief in the possibility of ESP make for good results and seem to be the real conditions which determine whether there are going to be any results at all. In this connection, it is interesting to note that the well-known English medium, Mrs. Eileen J. Garrett, achieved bad results in the Rhine experiments because, as she herself admits, she was unable to summon up any feeling for the soulless test cards. These few hints may suffice to give the reader at least a superficial idea of these experiments. The above-mentioned book by G.N.M. Tyrrell, late president of the Society for Psychical Research, contains an excellent summing up of all experiences in this field. Its author himself rendered great service to ESP research. From the physicist's side, the ESP experiments have been evaluated in a positive sense by Robert A. McConnell in an article entitled ESP, Fact or Fancy. As is only to be expected, every conceivable kind of attempt has been made to explain away these results, which seem to border on the miraculous and frankly impossible. But all such attempts come to grief on the facts, and the facts refuse so far to be argued out of existence. Rhine's experiments confront us with the fact that there are events which are related to one another experimentally, and in this case meaningfully, without there being any possibility of proving that this relation is a causal one, since the transmission exhibits none of the known properties of energy. There is therefore good reason to doubt whether it is a question of transmission at all. The time experiments rule out any such thing in principle, for it would be absurd to suppose that a situation which does not yet exist and will only occur in the future could transmit itself as a phenomenon of energy to a receiver in the present. it seems more likely that scientific explanation will have to begin with a criticism of our concepts of space and time on the one hand, and with the unconscious on the other. As I have said, it is impossible, with our present resources, to explain ESP, or the fact of meaningful coincidence, as a phenomenon of energy. This makes an end of the causal explanation as well, for effect cannot be understood as anything except a phenomenon of energy. Therefore, it cannot be a question of cause and effect, but of a falling together in time, a kind of simultaneity. Because of this quality of simultaneity, I have picked on the term synchronicity to designate a hypothetical factor equal in rank to causality as a principle of explanation. In my essay, On the Nature of the Psyche, I considered synchronicity as a psychically conditioned relativity of space and time. Rhine's experiments show that in relation to the psyche, space and time are, so to speak, elastic, and can apparently be reduced to almost vanishing point, as though they were dependent on psychic conditions and did not exist in themselves, but were only postulated by the conscious mind. In man's original view of the world, as we find it among primitives, space and time have a very precarious existence. They become fixed concepts only in the course of his mental development, thanks largely to the introduction of measurement. In themselves, space and time consist of nothing. They are hypostatized concepts born of the discriminating activity of the conscious mind, and they form the indispensable coordinates for describing the behavior of bodies in motion. They are, therefore, essentially psychic in origin, which is probably the reason that impelled Kant to regard them as a priori categories. But if space and time are only apparently properties of bodies in motion, and are created by the intellectual needs of the observer, then their relativization by psychic conditions is no longer a matter for astonishment, but is brought within the bounds of possibility. This possibility presents itself when the psyche observes, not external bodies, but itself. That is precisely what happens in Rhine's experiments. The subject's answer is not the result of his observing the physical cards. It is a product of pure imagination, of chance ideas which reveal the structure of that which produces them, namely the unconscious. Here I will only point out that it is the decisive factors in the unconscious psyche, the archetypes, which constitute the structure of the collective unconscious. The latter represents a psyche that is identical in all individuals. It cannot be directly perceived or represented, in contrast to the perceptible psychic phenomena, and on account of its irrepresentable nature, I have called it psychoid. The archetypes are formal factors responsible for the organization of unconscious psychic processes. They are patterns of behavior. At the same time, they have a specific charge and develop numinous effects which express themselves as affects. The affect produces a partial abaissement du niveau mental, for although it raises a particular content to a supernormal degree of luminosity, it does so by withdrawing so much energy from other possible contents of consciousness that they become darkened and eventually unconscious. Owing to the restriction of consciousness produced by the affect so long as it lasts, there is a corresponding lowering of orientation which in its turn gives the unconscious a favorable opportunity to slip into the space vacated. Thus, we regularly find that unexpected or otherwise inhibited unconscious contents break through and find expression in the affect. Such contents are very often of an inferior or primitive nature, and thus betray their archetypal origin. As I shall show further on, certain phenomena of simultaneity or synchronicity seem to be bound up with the archetypes. That is the reason why I mention the archetypes here. The extraordinary spatial orientation of animals may also point to the psychic relativity of space and time. The puzzling time orientation of the palalo worm, for instance, whose tail segments, loaded with sexual products, always appear on the surface of the sea the day before the last quarter of the moon in October and November,
might be mentioned in this connection. One of the causes suggested is the acceleration of the Earth owing to the gravitational pull of the Moon at this time. But, for astronomical reasons, this explanation cannot possibly be right. The relation which undoubtedly exists between the human menstruation period and the course of the Moon is connected with the latter only numerically and does not really coincide with it. Nor has it been proved that it ever did. The problem of synchronicity has puzzled me for a long time, ever since the middle 20s, when I was investigating the phenomena of the collective unconscious and kept on coming across connections which I simply could not explain as chance groupings or runs. What I found were coincidences which were connected so meaningfully that their chance concurrence would represent a degree of improbability that would have to be expressed by an astronomical figure. By way of example, I shall mention an incident from my own observation. A young woman I was treating had, at a critical moment, a dream in which she was given a golden scarab. While she was telling me this dream, I sat with my back to the closed window. Suddenly I heard a noise behind me, like a gentle tapping. I turned around and saw a flying insect knocking against the window pane from outside. I opened the window and caught the creature in the air as it flew in. It was the nearest analogy to a golden scarab that one finds in our latitudes, a scarabate beetle, the common rose chafer, Cetonia aurata, which, contrary to its usual habits, had evidently felt an urge to get into a dark room at this particular moment. I must admit that nothing like it ever happened to me before or since, and that the dream of the patient has remained unique in my experience. I should like to mention another case that is typical of a certain category of events. The wife of one of my patients, a man in his 50s, once told me in conversation that, at the deaths of her mother and her grandmother, a number of birds gathered outside the windows of the death chamber. I had heard similar stories from other people. When her husband's treatment was nearing its end, his neurosis having been cleared up, he developed some apparently quite innocuous symptoms which seemed to me, however, to be those of heart disease. I sent him along to a specialist, who, after examining him, told me in writing that he could find no cause for anxiety. On the way back from this consultation, with the medical report in his pocket, my patient collapsed in the street. As he was brought home dying, his wife was already in a great state of anxiety because, soon after her husband had gone to the doctor, a whole flock of birds alighted on their house. She naturally remembered the similar incidents that had happened at the death of her own relatives and feared the worst. Although I was personally acquainted with the people concerned and know very well that the facts here reported are true, I do not imagine for a moment that this will induce anybody who is determined to regard such things as pure chance to change his mind. My sole object in relating these two incidents is simply to give some indication of how meaningful coincidences usually present themselves in practical life. The meaningful connection is obvious enough in the first case in view of the approximate identity of the chief objects, the scarab and the beetle, but in the second case the death and the flock of birds seem to be incommensurable with one another. If one considers, however, that in the Babylonian Hades the souls wore a feather dress, and that in ancient Egypt the ba, or soul, was thought of as a bird, it is not too far-fetched to suppose that there may be some archetypal symbolism at work. Had such an incident occurred in a dream, that interpretation would be justified by the comparative psychological material. There also seems to be an archetypal foundation to the first case. It was an extraordinarily difficult case to treat, and up to the time of the dream little or no progress had been made. I should explain that the main reason for this was my patient's animus, which was steeped in Cartesian philosophy and clung so rigidly to its own idea of reality that the efforts of 3 doctors, I was the third, had not been able to weaken it. Evidently something quite irrational was needed which was beyond my powers to produce. The dream alone was enough to disturb ever so slightly the rationalistic attitude of my patient. But when the scarab came flying in through the window in actual fact,
her natural being could burst through the armor of her animus possession, and the process of transformation could at last begin to move. Any essential change of attitude signifies a psychic renewal, which is usually accompanied by symbols of rebirth in the patient's dreams and fantasies. The scarab is a classic example of a rebirth symbol. The ancient Egyptian book of What Is, in the netherworld, describes how the dead sun god changes himself at the 10th station into Khepri, the scarab, and then, at the 12th station, mounts the barge which carries the rejuvenated sun god into the morning sky. The only difficulty here is that with educated people, cryptomnesia often cannot be ruled out with certainty, although my patient did not happen to know this symbol. But this does not alter the fact that the psychologist is continually coming up against cases where the emergence of symbolic parallels cannot be explained without the hypothesis of the collective unconscious. Meaningful coincidences, which are to be distinguished from meaningless chance groupings, therefore seem to rest on an archetypal foundation. At least all the cases in my experience, and there is a large number of them, show this characteristic. What that means I have already indicated above. Although anyone with my experience in this field can easily recognize their archetypal character, he will find it difficult to link them up with the psychic conditions in Rhine's experiments, because the latter contain no direct evidence of any constellation of the archetype. Nor is the emotional situation the same as in my examples. Nevertheless, it must be remembered that with Rhine the first series of experiments generally produced the best results, which then quickly fell off. But when it was possible to arouse a new interest in the essentially rather boring experiment, the results improved again. It follows from this that the emotional factor plays an important role. Affectivity, however, rests to a large extent on the instincts, whose formal aspect is the archetype. There is yet another psychological analogy between my two cases and the Rhine experiments, though it is not quite so obvious. These apparently quite different situations have as their common characteristic an element of impossibility. The patient with the scarab found herself in an impossible situation because the treatment had got stuck and there seemed to be no way out of the impasse. In such situations, if they are serious enough, archetypal dreams are likely to occur which point out a possible line of advance one would never have thought of oneself. It is this kind of situation that constellates the archetype with the greatest regularity. In certain cases, the psychotherapist therefore sees himself obliged to discover the rationally insoluble problem towards which the patient's unconscious is steering. Once this is found, the deeper layers of the unconscious, the primordial images, are activated and the transformation of the personality can get underway. In the second case, there was the half-unconscious fear and the threat of a lethal end with no possibility of an adequate recognition of the situation. In Rhine's experiment, it is the impossibility of the task that ultimately fixes the subject's attention on the process going on inside of him, and thus gives the unconscious a chance to manifest itself. The questions set by the ESP experiment have an emotional effect right from the start, since they postulate something unknowable as being potentially knowable, and in that way take the possibility of a miracle seriously into account. This, regardless of the subject's skepticism, immediately appeals to his unconscious readiness to witness a miracle, and to the hope, latent in all men, that such a thing may yet be possible. Primitive superstition lies just below the surface of even the most tough-minded individuals, and it is precisely those who most fight against it who are the first to succumb to its suggestive effects. When therefore a serious experiment with all the authority of science behind it touches this readiness, it will inevitably give rise to an emotion which either accepts or rejects it with a good deal of affectivity. At all events, an affective expectation is present in one form or another, even though it may be denied. Here I would like to call attention to a possible misunderstanding which may be occasioned by the term synchronicity. I chose this term because the simultaneous occurrence of two meaningfully but not causally connected events seemed to me an essential criterion.
I am therefore using the general concept of synchronicity in the special sense of a coincidence in time of two or more causally unrelated events which have the same or a similar meaning, in contrast to synchronism, which simply means the simultaneous occurrence of two events. Synchronicity therefore means the simultaneous occurrence of a certain psychic state with one or more external events which appear as meaningful parallels to the momentary subjective state, and, in certain cases, vice versa. My two examples illustrate this in different ways. In the case of the scarab, the simultaneity is immediately obvious, but not in the second example. It is true that the flock of birds occasioned a vague fear, but that can be explained causally. The wife of my patient was certainly not conscious beforehand of any fear that could be compared with my own apprehensions, for the symptoms, pains in the throat, were not of a kind to make the layman suspect anything bad. The unconscious, however, often knows more than the conscious, and it seems to me possible that the woman's unconscious had already got wind of the danger. If, therefore, we rule out a conscious psychic content such as the idea of deadly danger, there is an obvious simultaneity between the flock of birds, in its traditional meaning, and the death of the husband. The psychic state, if we disregard the possible but still not demonstrable excitation of the unconscious, appears to be dependent on the external event. The woman's psyche is nevertheless involved insofar as the birds settled on her house and were observed by her. For this reason, it seems to me probable that her unconscious was in fact constellated. The flock of birds has, as such, a traditional mantic significance. This is also apparent in the woman's own interpretation, and it therefore looks as if the birds represented an unconscious premonition of death. The physicians of the Romantic age would probably have talked of sympathy or magnetism. But, as I have said, such phenomena cannot be explained causally unless one permits oneself the most fantastic ad hoc hypotheses. The interpretation of the birds as an omen is, as we have seen, based on two earlier coincidences of a similar kind. It did not yet exist at the time of the grandmother's death. There the coincidence was represented only by the death and the gathering of the birds. Both then and at the mother's death the coincidence was obvious, but in the third case it could only be verified when the dying man was brought into the house. I mention these complications because they have an important bearing on the concept of synchronicity. Let us take another example. An acquaintance of mine saw and experienced in a dream the sudden death of a friend, with all the characteristic details. The dreamer was in Europe at the time, and the friend in America. The death was confirmed next morning by telegram, and 10 days later a letter confirmed the details. Comparison of European time with American time showed that the death occurred at least an hour before the dream. The dreamer had gone to bed late and not slept until about 1 o'clock. The dream occurred at approximately 2 in the morning. The dream experience is not synchronous with the death. Experiences of this kind frequently take place a little before or after the critical event. J.W. Dunn mentions a particularly instructive dream he had in the spring of 1902 when serving in the Boer War. He seemed to be standing on a volcanic mountain. It was an island, which he had dreamed about before and knew was threatened by a catastrophic volcanic eruption, like Krakatoa. Terrified, he wanted to save the 4,000 inhabitants. He tried to get the French officials on the neighboring island to mobilize all available shipping for the rescue work. Here the dream began to develop the typical nightmare motifs of hurrying, chasing, and not arriving on time, and all the while there hovered before his mind the words, 4,000 people will be killed unless. A few days later Dunn received with his mail a copy of the Daily Telegraph, and his eye fell on the following headlines. Volcanic disaster in Martinique. Town swept away. An avalanche of flame.
probable loss of over 40,000 lives. The dream did not take place at the moment of the actual catastrophe, but only when the paper was already on its way to him with the news. While reading it, he misread 40,000 as 4,000. The mistake became fixed as paramnesia, so that whenever he told the dream, he invariably said 4,000 instead of 40,000. Not until 15 years later, when he copied out the article, did he discover his mistake. His unconscious knowledge had made the same mistake in reading as himself. The fact that he had dreamed this shortly before the news reached him is something that happens fairly frequently. We often dream about people from whom we receive a letter by the next post. I have ascertained on several occasions that at the moment when the dream occurred, the letter was already lying in the post office of the addressee. I can also confirm, from my own experience, the reading mistake. During the Christmas of 1918, I was much occupied with Orphism, and in particular with the Orphic fragment in Malalas, where the primordial light is described as the Trinitarian metis, phanes, erikepios. I consistently read erikapios instead of erikepios, as in the text. Actually, both readings occur. This misreading became fixed as paramnesia, and later I always remembered the name as erikapios, and only discovered 30 years afterward that Malalas text as erikepios. Just at this time, one of my patients, whom I had not seen for a month, and who knew nothing of my studies, had a dream in which an unknown man handed her a piece of paper, and on it was written a Latin hymn to a god called Erisipios. The dreamer was able to write this hymn down upon waking. The language it was written in was a peculiar mixture of Latin, French, and Italian. The lady had an elementary knowledge of Latin, knew a bit more Italian, and spoke French fluently. The name Erisipios was completely unknown to her, which is not surprising as she had no knowledge of the classics. Our two towns were about 50 miles apart, and there had been no communication between us for a month. Oddly enough, the variant of the name affected the very same vowel which I too had misread, A instead of E, but her unconscious misread it another way, I instead of E. I can only suppose that she had unconsciously read, not my mistake, but the text in which the Latin transliteration, Erisipios, occurs, and was evidently put off her stroke by my misreading. Synchronistic events rest on the simultaneous occurrence of two different psychic states. One of them is the normal, probable state, that is, the one that is causally explicable, and the other, the critical experience, is the one that cannot be derived causally from the first. In the case of sudden death, the critical experience cannot be recognized immediately as extrasensory perception, but can only be verified as such afterwards. Yet even in the case of the scarab, what is immediately experienced is a psychic state or psychic image which differs from the dream image only because it can be verified immediately. In the case of the flock of birds, there was in the woman an unconscious excitation or fear which was certainly conscious to me and caused me to send the patient to a heart specialist. In all these cases, whether it is a question of spatial or of temporal ESP, we find the simultaneity of the normal or ordinary state with another state or experience which is not causally derivable from it, and whose objective existence can only be verified afterwards. This definition must be borne in mind particularly when it is a question of future events. They are evidently not synchronous, but are synchronistic, since they are experienced as psychic images in the present, as though the objective event already existed. An unexpected content which is directly or indirectly connected with some objective external event coincides with the ordinary psychic state. This is what I call synchronicity, and I maintain that we are dealing with exactly the same category of events, whether their objectivity appears separated from my consciousness in space or in time. This view is confirmed by Rhine's results insofar as they were not influenced by changes in space or time. Space and time, the conceptual coordinates of bodies in motion,
are probably at bottom one and the same, which is why we speak of a long or short space of time. And Philo Judaeus said long ago that the extension of heavenly motion is time. Synchronicity in space can equally well be conceived as perception in time, but remarkably enough, it is not so easy to understand synchronicity in time as spatial, for we cannot imagine any space in which future events are objectively present and could be experienced as such through a reduction of the spatial distance. But since experience has shown that under certain conditions, space and time can be reduced almost to zero, causality disappears along with them, because causality is bound up with the existence of space and time and physical changes, and consists essentially in the succession of cause and effect. For this reason, synchronistic phenomena cannot in principle be associated with any conceptions of causality. Hence the interconnection of meaningfully coincident factors must necessarily be thought of as a-causal. Here, for want of a demonstrable cause, we are all too likely to fall into the temptation of positing a transcendental one. But a cause can only be a demonstrable quantity. A transcendental cause is a contradiction in terms because anything transcendental cannot by definition be demonstrated. If we don't want to risk the hypothesis of a-causality, then the only alternative is to explain synchronistic phenomena as mere chance, which brings us into conflict with Rhine's ESP discoveries and other well-attested facts reported in the literature of parapsychology. Or else we are driven to the kind of reflections I described above, and must subject our basic principles of explanation to the criticism that space and time are constants in any given system only when they are measured without regard to psychic conditions. That is what regularly happens in scientific experiments. But when an event is observed without experimental restrictions, the observer can easily be influenced by an emotional state, which alters space and time by contraction. Every emotional state produces an alteration of consciousness, which Genet called abaissement du niveau mental. That is to say, there is a certain narrowing of consciousness and a corresponding strengthening of the unconscious which, particularly in the case of strong affects, is noticeable even to the layman. The tone of the unconscious is heightened, thereby creating a gradient for the unconscious to flow towards the conscious. The conscious then comes under the influence of unconscious instinctual impulses and contents. These are, as a rule, complexes whose ultimate basis is the archetype, the instinctual pattern. The unconscious also contains subliminal perceptions, as well as forgotten memory images that cannot be reproduced at the moment, and perhaps not at all. Among the subliminal contents, we must distinguish perceptions from what I would call an inexplicable knowledge or an immediacy of psychic images. Whereas the sense perceptions can be related to probable or possible sensory stimuli below the threshold of consciousness, this knowledge, or the immediacy of unconscious images, either has no recognizable foundation, or else we find that there are recognizable causal connections with certain already existing and often archetypal contents. But these images, whether rooted in an already existing basis or not, stand in an analogous or equivalent, that is, meaningful, relationship to objective occurrences which have no recognizable or even conceivable causal relationship with them. How could an event remote in space and time produce a corresponding psychic image when the transmission of energy necessary for this is not even thinkable? However incomprehensible it may appear, we are finally compelled to assume that there is in the unconscious something like an a priori knowledge or an immediacy of events which lacks any causal basis. At any rate, our conception of causality is incapable of explaining the facts. In view of this complicated situation, it may be worthwhile to recapitulate the argument discussed above, and this can best be done with the aid of our examples. In Rhine's experiment, I made the assumption that, owing to the tense expectation or emotional state of the subject, an already existing, correct,
but unconscious image of the result enables his conscious mind to score a more than chance number of hits. The scarab dream is a conscious representation arising from an unconscious, already existing image of the situation that will occur on the following day, that is, the recounting of the dream and the appearance of the rose chafer. The wife of the patient who died had an unconscious knowledge of the impending death. The flock of birds evoked the corresponding memory images, and consequently her fear. Similarly, the almost simultaneous dream of the violent death of the friend arose from an already existing unconscious knowledge of it. In all these cases, and others like them, there seems to be an a priori, causally inexplicable knowledge of a situation which at the time is unknowable. Synchronicity therefore consists of two factors. A. An unconscious image comes into consciousness either directly, that is, literally, or indirectly, symbolized or suggested, in the form of a dream, idea, or premonition. B. An objective situation coincides with this content. The one is as puzzling as the other. How does the unconscious image arise, and how the coincidence? I understand only too well why people prefer to doubt the reality of these things. Here I will only pose the question. Later in the study I will try to answer it. As regards the role which effects play in the occurrence of synchronistic events, I should perhaps mention that this is by no means a new idea, but was already known to Avicenna and Albertus Magnus. On the subject of magic, Albertus Magnus writes, Narrator's note. This is the beginning of a fairly long excerpt that Jung quotes. I will notify you when we've returned to Jung's essay. I discovered an instructive account of magic in Avicenna's Liber Sectus Naturalium, which says that a certain power to alter things indwells in the human soul and subordinates the other things to her, particularly when she is swept into a great excess of love or hate or the like. When therefore the soul of a man falls into a great excess of any passion, it can be proved by experiment that it, the excess, binds things magically and alters them in the way it wants. And for a long time I did not believe it. But after I had read the negromantic books and others of the kind on signs and magic, I found that the emotionality of the human soul is the chief cause of all these things, whether because, on account of her great emotion, she alters her bodily substance and the other things towards which she strives, or because, on account of her dignity, the other, lower things are subject to her, or because the appropriate hour or astrological situation or another power coincides with so inordinate an emotion, and we, in consequence, believe that what this power does is then done by the soul. Whoever would learn the secret of doing and undoing these things must know that everyone can influence everything magically if he falls into a great excess, and he must do it at that hour when the excess befalls him, and operate with the things which the soul prescribes. For the soul is then so desirous of the matter she would accomplish that of her own accord, she seizes on the more significant and better astrological hour, which also rules over the things suited to that matter. Thus it is the soul who desires a thing more intensely, who makes things more effective and more like what comes forth. Such is the manner of production with everything the soul intensely desires. Everything she does with that aim in view possesses motive power and efficacy for what the soul desires. Narrator's note, that's the end of the excerpt. We're now returning to Jung's essay, and I will place some information regarding that text in the description in case you're interested in it. This text shows clearly that synchronistic, magical happenings are regarded as being dependent on affects. Naturally, Albertus Magnus, in accordance with the spirit of his age, explains this by postulating a magical faculty in the soul, without considering that the psychic process itself is just as much arranged as the coinciding image which anticipates the external physical process. This image originates in the unconscious and therefore belongs to those cogitationes quae sunt nobis independentes, which, in the opinion of Arnold Geulincx,
are prompted by God and do not spring from our own thinking. Goethe thinks of synchronistic events in the same magical way. Thus he says, in his conversations with Eckermann, we all have certain electric and magnetic powers within us, and ourselves exercise an attractive and repelling force, according as we come into touch with something like or unlike. After these general considerations, let us return to the problem, or the empirical basis of synchronicity. The main difficulty here is to procure empirical material from which we can draw reasonably certain conclusions, and unfortunately this difficulty is not an easy one to solve. The experiences in question are not ready to hand. We must therefore look in the obscurest corners and summon up courage to shock the prejudices of our age if we want to broaden the basis of our understanding of nature. When Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter with his telescope, he immediately came into head-on collision with the prejudices of his learned contemporaries. Nobody knew what a telescope was and what it could do. Never before had anyone talked of the moons of Jupiter. Naturally, every age thinks that all ages before it were prejudiced, and today we think this more than ever and are just as wrong as all the previous ages that thought so. How often have we not seen the truth condemned? It is sad but unfortunately true that man learns nothing from history. This melancholy fact will present us with the greatest difficulties as soon as we set about collecting empirical material that would throw a little light on this dark subject, for we shall be quite certain to find it where all the authorities have assured us that nothing is to be found. Reports of remarkable isolated cases, however well authenticated, are unprofitable and lead at most to their reporter being regarded as a credulous person. Even the careful recording and verification of a large number of such cases, as in the work of Gurney, Myers, and Podmore, have made next to no impression on the scientific world. The great majority of professional psychologists and psychiatrists seem to be completely ignorant of these researches. The results of the ESP and PK experiments have provided a statistical basis for evaluating the phenomenon of synchronicity, and at the same time have pointed out the important role played by the psychic factor. This fact prompted me to ask whether it would not be possible to find a method which would, on the one hand, demonstrate the existence of synchronicity and, on the other hand, disclose psychic contents which would at least give us a clue to the nature of the psychic factor involved. I asked myself, in other words, whether there were not a method which would yield measurable results and at the same time give us an insight into the psychic background of synchronicity. That there are certain essential psychic conditions for synchronistic phenomena we have already seen from the ESP experiments, although the latter are in the nature of the case restricted to the fact of coincidence, and only stress its psychic background without illuminating it any further. I had known for a long time that there were intuitive or mantic methods which start with the psychic factor and take the existence of synchronicity as self-evident. I therefore turned my attention first of all to the intuitive technique for grasping the total situation, which is so characteristic of China, namely the I Ching or Book of Changes. Unlike the Greek-trained Western mind, the Chinese mind does not aim at grasping details for their own sake, but at a view which sees the detail as part of a whole. For obvious reasons, a cognitive operation of this kind is impossible to the unaided intellect. Judgment must therefore rely much more on the irrational functions of consciousness, that is, on sensation, the sense du real, and intuition, perception by means of subliminal contents. The I Ching, which we can well call the experimental foundation of classical Chinese philosophy, is one of the oldest known methods for grasping a situation as a whole and thus placing the details against a cosmic background, the interplay of yin and yang. This grasping of the whole is obviously the aim of science as well, but it is a goal that necessarily lies very far off because science, whenever possible, proceeds experimentally and in all cases statistically. Experiment, however, consists in asking a definite question which excludes as far as possible anything disturbing and irrelevant.
It makes conditions, imposes them on nature, and in this way forces her to give an answer to a question devised by man. She is prevented from answering out of the fullness of her possibilities, since these possibilities are restricted as far as practicable. For this purpose there is created in the laboratory a situation which is artificially restricted to the question and which compels nature to give an unequivocal answer. The workings of nature in her unrestricted wholeness are completely excluded. If we want to know what these workings are, we need a method of inquiry which imposes the fewest possible conditions, or if possible no conditions at all, and then leaves nature to answer out of her fullness. In the laboratory experiment, the known and established procedure forms the stable factor in the statistical compilation and comparison of the results. In the intuitive or mantic experiment with the whole, on the other hand, there is no need of any question which imposes conditions and restricts the wholeness of the natural process. It is given every possible chance to express itself. In the I Ching, the coins fall just as happens to suit them. From the point of view of an observer, an unknown question is followed by a rationally unintelligible answer. Thus far, the conditions for a total reaction are positively ideal. The disadvantage, however, leaps to the eye. In contrast to the scientific experiment, one does not know what has happened. To overcome this drawback, two Chinese sages, King Wen and the Duke of Chao, in the 12th century before our era, basing themselves on the hypothesis of the unity of nature, sought to explain the simultaneous occurrence of a psychic state with the physical process as an equivalence of meaning. In other words, they supposed that the same living reality was expressing itself in the psychic state as in the physical. But, in order to verify such an hypothesis, some limiting condition was needed in this apparently limitless experiment, namely a definite form of physical procedure, a method or technique which forced nature to answer in even and odd numbers. These, as representatives of yin and yang, are found both in the unconscious and in nature in the characteristic form of opposites, as the mother and father of everything that happens, and they therefore form the tertium comparationis between the psychic inner world and the physical outer world. Thus the two sages devised a method by which an inner state could be represented as an outer one, and vice versa. This naturally presupposes an intuitive knowledge of the meaning of each oracle figure. The I Ching, therefore, consists of a collection of 64 interpretations in which the meaning of each of the possible yin-yang combinations is worked out. These interpretations formulate the inner unconscious knowledge that corresponds to the state of consciousness at the moment, and this psychological situation coincides with the chance results of the method, that is, with the odd and even numbers resulting from the fall of the coins or the division of the yarrow stalks. The method, like all divinatory or intuitive techniques, is based on an acausal or synchronistic connective principle. In practice, as any unprejudiced person will admit, many obvious cases of synchronicity occur during the experiment, which could be rationally and somewhat arbitrarily explained away as mere projections. But if one assumes that they really are what they appear to be, then they can only be meaningful coincidences for which, as far as we know, there is no causal explanation. The method consists either in dividing the 49 yarrow stalks into two heaps at random and counting off the heaps by 3s and 5s, or in throwing 3 coins 6 times, each line of the hexagram being determined by the value of a verse and reverse. Heads 3, tails 2. The experiment is based on a triadic principle, 2 trigrams, and contains 64 mutations, each corresponding to a psychic situation. These are discussed at length in the text and appended commentaries. There is also a Western method of very ancient origin, which is based on the same general principle as the I Ching, the only difference being that in the West this principle is not triadic, but, significantly enough, tetradic, and the result is not a hexagram built up of yang and yin lines, but 16 figures composed of odd and even numbers. 12 of them are arranged, according to certain rules, in the astrological houses. The experiment is based on 4x4 lines consisting of a random number of points which the questioner marks in the sand or on paper from right to left. In true Occidental fashion, the combination of all these factors goes into considerably more detail than the I Ching. Here too there are any amount of meaningful coincidences, but they are as a rule harder to understand and therefore less obvious than in the latter.
In the Western method, which was known since the 13th century as the ars geomantica, or the art of punctuation, and enjoyed a widespread vogue, there are no real commentaries, since its use was only mantic and never philosophical like that of the I Ching. Though the results of both procedures point in the desired direction, they do not provide any basis for a statistical evaluation. I have, therefore, looked round for another intuitive technique and have hit on astrology, which, at least in its modern form, claims to give a more or less total picture of the individual's character. There is no lack of commentaries here. Indeed, we find a bewildering profusion of them, a sure sign that interpretation is neither simple nor certain. The meaningful coincidence we are looking for is immediately apparent in astrology, since the astronomical data are said by astrologers to correspond to individual traits of character. From the remotest times, the various planets, houses, zodiacal signs, and aspects have all had meanings that serve as a basis for a character study or for an interpretation of a given situation. It is always possible to object that the result does not agree with our psychological knowledge of the situation or character in question, and it is difficult to refute the assertion that knowledge of character is a highly subjective affair, because in characterology there are no infallible or even reliable signs that can in any way be measured or calculated, an objection that also applies to graphology, although in practice it enjoys widespread recognition. This criticism, together with the absence of reliable criteria for determining traits of character, makes the meaningful coincidence of horoscope structure and individual character postulated by astrology seem inapplicable for the purpose here under discussion. If, therefore, we want astrology to tell us anything about the acausal connection of events, we must discard this uncertain diagnosis of character and put in its place an absolutely certain and indubitable fact. One such fact is the marriage connection between two persons. Since antiquity, the main traditional astrological and alchemical correspondence to marriage has been the conjunctio solis et lunae, the conjunctio lunae et lunae, and the conjunction of the moon with the ascendant. There are others, but these do not come within the main traditional stream. The ascendant-descendant axis was introduced into the tradition because it has long been regarded as having a particularly important influence on the personality. As I shall refer later to the conjunction and opposition of Mars and Venus, I may say here that these are related to marriage only because the conjunction or opposition of these two planets points to a love relationship, and this may or may not produce a marriage. So far as my experiment is concerned, we have to investigate the coincident aspects, and in the horoscopes of married pairs in relation to those of unmarried pairs. It will, further, be of interest to compare the relation of the above aspects to those of the aspects which belong only in a minor degree to the main traditional stream. No belief in astrology is needed to carry out such an investigation, only the birth dates, an astronomical almanac, and a table of logarithms for working out the horoscope. As the above three mantic procedures show, the method best adapted to the nature of chance is the numerical method. Since the remotest times, men have used numbers to establish meaningful coincidences, that is, coincidences that can be interpreted. There is something peculiar, one might even say mysterious, about numbers. They have never been entirely robbed of their own numinous aura. If, so a textbook of mathematics tells us, a group of objects is deprived of every single one of its properties or characteristics, there still remains, at the end, its number, which seems to indicate that number is something irreducible. I am not concerned here with the logic of this mathematical argument, but only with its psychology. The sequence of natural numbers turns out to be unexpectedly more than a mere stringing together of identical units. It contains the whole of mathematics and everything yet to be discovered in this field. Number, therefore, is in one sense an unpredictable entity. Although I would not care to undertake to say anything illuminating about the interrelation between two such apparently incommensurable things as number and synchronicity, I cannot refrain from pointing out that not only were they always brought into connection with one another, but that both possess numinosity and mystery as their common characteristics. Number has invariably been used to characterize some numinous object, and all numbers from 1 to 9 are sacred, just as 10, 12, 13, 14, 28, 32, and 40 have a special significance. The most elementary quality about an object is whether it is one or many. Number helps more than anything else to bring order into the chaos of appearances. It is the predestined instrument for creating order, or for apprehending an already existing, but still unknown, regular arrangement or orderedness. It may well be the most primitive element of order in the human mind, seeing that the numbers 1 to 4 occur with the greatest frequency and have the widest incidence. In other words, primitive patterns of order are mostly triads or tetrads. That numbers have an archetypal foundation is not, by the way, a conjecture of mine, but of certain mathematicians, as we shall see in due course. Hence, it is not such an audacious conclusion after all, if we define number psychologically as an archetype of order which has become conscious. Remarkably enough, the psychic images of wholeness which are spontaneously produced by the unconscious, the symbols of the self in mandala form, also have a mathematical structure. They are as a rule quaternities, or their multiples. These structures not only express order, they also create it. That is why they generally appear in times of psychic disorientation in order to compensate a chaotic state or as formulations of numinous experiences. It must be emphasized yet again that they are not inventions of the conscious mind, but are spontaneous products of the unconscious, as has been sufficiently shown by experience. Naturally, the conscious mind can imitate these patterns of order, but such imitations do not prove that the originals are conscious inventions. From this it follows irrefutably that the unconscious uses number as an ordering factor. It is generally believed that numbers were invented or thought out by man, and are therefore nothing but concepts of quantities, containing nothing that was not previously put into them by the human intellect. But it is equally possible that numbers were found or discovered. In that case, they are not only concepts, but something more, autonomous entities which somehow contain more than just quantities. Unlike concepts, they are based not on any psychic conditions, but on the quality of being themselves, on a so-ness that cannot be expressed by an intellectual concept. Under these conditions, they might easily be endowed with qualities that have still to be discovered. I must confess that I incline to the view that numbers were as much found as invented, and that in the consequence they possess a relative autonomy analogous to that of the archetypes. They would then have, in common with the latter, the quality of being pre-existent to consciousness, and hence, on occasion, of conditioning it rather than being conditioned by it. The archetypes, too, as a priori forms of representation, are as much found as invented. They are discovered inasmuch as one did not know of their unconscious autonomous existence, and invented inasmuch as their presence was inferred from analogous representational structures. Accordingly, it would seem that natural numbers have an archetypal character. If that is so, then not only would certain numbers and combinations of numbers have a relation to and an effect on certain archetypes, but the reverse would also be true. The first case is equivalent to number magic, but the second is equivalent to inquiring whether numbers, in conjunction with the combination of archetypes found in astrology, would show a tendency to behave in a special way. And that ends Chapter 1 of Synchronicity, an Acausal Connecting Principle, from Volume 8 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung. Thank you for listening.